How do propaganda systems transform neighbors into enemies worthy of destruction? I've asked myself this question repeatedly while studying how ordinary people become participants in atrocities. What I've discovered is that hatred rarely emerges spontaneously on a mass scale. Instead, it's carefully manufactured through deliberate exploitation of the psychological mechanisms we've been exploring. Propaganda weaponizes our existing psychological vulnerabilities. The same tendencies that make us respond to authority, conform to group expectations, categorize others, and adjust our moral standards incrementally can be deliberately manipulated. What happened at My Lai occurred without a formal propaganda system. But these psychological mechanisms become dramatically more dangerous when systematically exploited by sophisticated propaganda machines. The process resembles a slow-burning fuse leading to an explosion. At first, barely noticeable sparks of division appear, reasonable-sounding concerns about economic influence or cultural differences. The fuse burns gradually through stages of increasing hostility, with each step seeming logical to those caught in its path. By the time the explosion of violence occurs, the psychological groundwork has been so thoroughly laid that it appears almost inevitable to participants. Propaganda systems follow a predictable escalation pattern. They begin by establishing strong group identity during periods of hardship or uncertainty. This creates the psychological foundation of a cohesive us. Next, they introduce perceived threats from a targeted outgroup, activating defensive psychological mechanisms that contract the circle of moral concern. Authority figures and institutions provide legitimacy to these divisions through official-looking studies, statistics, and expert opinions. Finally, dehumanization intensifies gradually, transforming the outgroup from different humans into biological threats requiring elimination. Nazi Germany provides the most thoroughly documented case of this process. Their propaganda didn't begin with calls for extermination. Early messaging emphasized German national identity and pride during economic hardship following World War I. Jewish Germans were initially portrayed as different and problematic, but still human. Government offices produced charts showing Jewish control of various institutions, giving bigotry the veneer of legitimacy. The escalation followed a careful sequence that desensitized ordinary Germans. First came social exclusion and economic restrictions that seemed relatively mild. Then more visible persecution, identifying markers, public humiliation, and property destruction during events like Kristallnacht. Only after years of intensifying dehumanization did the Nazis implement mass murder, by which point much of the population had been psychologically prepared to accept or ignore what was happening. Diary entries from the period reveal this psychological adaptation. One German woman wrote in 1933 that regulations against Jewish businesses seemed extreme, but by 1938 she described violence against Jewish neighbors with disturbing indifference. The incremental nature allowed moral recalibration without triggering the internal alarm that a sudden extreme shift might have caused. In Rwanda, we see the same pattern compressed into a shorter time frame. Radio broadcasts spent months calling Tutsis cockroaches before the genocide began. The dehumanizing language transformed neighbors into vermin, making their extermination seem like a necessary cleansing rather than mass murder. The radio announcers became trusted authorities, providing permission and direction for the violence that followed. These patterns provide a template for recognizing dangerous propaganda in any era. The psychological mechanisms remain consistent. Establish group identity, create authority structures that legitimize prejudice, manufacture threats from the targeted group, dehumanize them incrementally, and normalize increasingly extreme actions against them. Today's media environment creates new vectors for these same psychological manipulations. Digital technologies allow propaganda to be precisely targeted to receptive audiences. Echo chambers reinforce increasingly extreme viewpoints without exposure to contradictory information. Anonymous online spaces reduce accountability for dehumanizing language. Viral sharing mechanisms reward emotional content that often demonizes outgroups. I've traced how everyday internet users moved from mainstream political frustration to increasingly radical forums, where dehumanizing language became normalized. The psychological journey followed the same pattern. Strengthening group identity, accepting the authority of ideological leaders, perceiving existential threats from outgroups, and gradually adopting dehumanizing frameworks that justified extreme positions. Understanding these mechanisms makes clear that propaganda isn't primarily about factual persuasion. It's about psychological transformation. It changes how people categorize others and what moral rules they apply to those categories. It shifts perception so completely that otherwise good people can participate in or tolerate tremendous harm while maintaining positive self-images. This understanding connects directly to how these same psychological mechanisms operate in digital spaces today. The tools and techniques have evolved, but the basic psychological vulnerabilities remain unchanged. Digital spaces create new opportunities for similar psychological manipulation, often without the central control that historical propaganda systems required. What turns ordinary internet users into digital tormentors? How do online environments enable the same psychological mechanisms we've seen throughout history? The digital world hasn't created new human tendencies. It has created new contexts that activate ancient psychological patterns in particularly powerful ways. Understanding these digital dynamics completes our picture of how good people digital dehumanization participating from trolling to tribalism without ever deciding what turns ordinary internet users into digital tormentors. I've spent countless hours watching this transformation happen in real time, seeing people who are kind and reasonable in person become unrecognizably cruel behind a screen. The digital world hasn't invented new psychological tendencies in humans, but it has created an environment that activates our darkest impulses with frightening efficiency. Online spaces create unique conditions that amplify the psychological mechanisms we've been exploring. Think about what happens when you go online. You're physically alone yet connected to millions, invisible to others yet able to impact them, free from immediate social consequences, yet able to receive instant gratification. These conditions create a perfect storm for human behavior to deteriorate. I interviewed a college student who participated in an online harassment campaign against a female game developer. I never thought of it as harassment, he told me. It felt like standing up against corruption in gaming journalism. But when I saw her talk about receiving death threats and having to leave her home, I realized we had caused real harm to a real person. His experience highlights the psychological distance digital interaction creates. Actions causing serious damage feel abstract and justified to participants. The real-world consequences of online behavior can be devastating. Teens have taken their lives after sustained cyberbullying. Public figures have gone into hiding after receiving credible threats. Ordinary people have lost jobs, relationships, and mental health after becoming targets of online mobs. In 2016, a man opened fire in a pizza restaurant because online conspiracy theories convinced him children were being trafficked there. The digital and physical worlds aren't separate. Online actions spill into real lives. Anonymity plays a crucial role in overriding moral restraints, functioning similarly to authority by reducing personal accountability. When hidden behind a username, normal social consequences disappear. You don't see disappointed faces or hear hurt responses. You don't risk your reputation. This creates what psychologists call the online disinhibition effect, the tendency to behave online in ways you would never consider in person. Research confirms this effect. A study asked participants to deliver criticism either face-to-face, by video call, audio call, or text chat. The more distant and anonymous the method, the harsher and more dehumanizing the criticism became. People who were polite in person became brutal when hiding behind text. Anonymity didn't create new personalities. It removed social restraints. Online group dynamics create powerful pressure for conformity and escalation. Social media platforms develop cultures with unwritten rules about acceptable targets. New members quickly learn that joining attacks earns social rewards, while challenging the consensus brings punishment through dogpiling or exclusion. The Gamergate controversy exemplifies this dynamic perfectly. What began as criticism of a female game developer quickly escalated into a massive harassment campaign. Thousands of people who considered themselves ethical gamers participated in increasingly extreme behavior. Doxing, death threats, and coordinated attacks that drove several women from their homes. Many participants later expressed shock at how far things went. Yet in the moment, group pressure normalized these actions. Digital dehumanization happens through mechanisms enabled by online environments. You don't see a complete human being, just a profile picture, username, and text. This reduction makes it easier to categorize someone as other and apply different moral standards. The distance reduces empathy. You don't witness the emotional impact of your words. The language of online spaces accelerates dehumanization. People become social justice warriors, incels, NPCs, or snowflakes rather than complex individuals. These labels flatten humans into caricatures, making it easier to dismiss their experiences. Each label carries implied permission for specific types of treatment. Certain groups become acceptable targets based solely on categorization. Online conflict typically follows an incremental pattern, creating moral slippery slopes. Few people jump directly into extreme harassment. Instead, they start with mild criticism that seems reasonable. As group dynamics reward escalation, behavior intensifies step by step. Each increment seems small, but the cumulative effect moves participants far beyond what they initially considered acceptable. A former participant in an extremist forum described this process. It started with edgy jokes, then slightly meaner jokes, then arguments about why certain groups deserved mockery. Before I realized what was happening, I was in conversations about violence that I would have found horrifying 6 months earlier. Research shows that ordinary people engage in behavior online they would never consider in person. One study found 41% of Americans admit to participating in some form of online harassment, including many who consider themselves ethical people. This creates cognitive dissonance resolved through justifications. They deserved it. It's just the internet. I was joking. Digital environments amplify these mechanisms by removing normal social restraints while adding anonymity and distance. They combine all the psychological factors we've discussed. They remove accountability, create powerful group dynamics, facilitate dehumanization through labeling, and enable incremental moral disengagement. The most disturbing aspect is how digital dehumanization reflects existing social divides. Online hatred follows patterns of power and marginalization already present in society. The same groups who face discrimination offline often experience the most severe forms of online harassment. Understanding these mechanisms doesn't excuse harmful behavior, but helps explain why decent people participate in it. More importantly, it points towards solutions. If digital environments currently amplify our worst tendencies, we can design spaces that do the opposite, that encourage accountability, humanize others, reward moderation, and make it easier to see the impact of our words. Resisting the invisible architecture. What psychological tools can protect you from becoming an unwitting participant in harm? I've spent years asking myself this question, especially after seeing how these mechanisms have operated throughout history and in my own life. The uncomfortable truth is that none of us are immune to these forces. Not you, not me, not anyone. I remember interviewing a former cult member who told me, "I always thought I was too smart to be manipulated." That belief was exactly what made me vulnerable. Her words have stayed with me because they capture something essential about human psychology. Our confidence that we're different, more moral, more aware, more resistant than others, often becomes our blind spot. The research is clear. Simply knowing about these psychological mechanisms doesn't provide sufficient protection against them. In one revealing study, participants learned about Milgram's obedience experiments and the power of authority. When asked if they would comply with orders to shock an innocent person, nearly all said no. Yet when those same participants were placed in a modified version of the experiment, their compliance rates were nearly identical to those who had never heard of Milgram's work. Knowledge without specific resistance strategies doesn't translate into changed behavior. So how do we resist harmful social pressures? The research points to several effective strategies. Resisting authority pressure asterisk. Question the legitimacy of authority figures when their directives conflict with ethical principles. Explicitly reclaim personal responsibility with phrases like, "I'm not comfortable with this. I'm choosing not to participate." Create physical and psychological distance when you feel your judgment becoming compromised. I witnessed this last strategy in action when a junior employee at a financial firm stepped away from a meeting where his team was planning to misrepresent data. That brief distance allowed him to call a senior ethics officer, preventing a major violation before it occurred. Maintaining moral autonomy in groups asterisk. Create an identity reference group separate from the pressuring group. Identify and connect with others who share your concerns, forming minority solidarity. Develop role distance. Participate in a role while remembering it isn't your complete identity. When soldiers who refused to participate in atrocities were interviewed, many described mentally. Consulting valued others, parents, religious leaders, friends, whose moral standards they wished to uphold. They asked themselves, what would this person I respect think of my actions right now? Countering dehumanization **. Notice categorical labels that replace individual identities. Watch for metaphors comparing people to animals, objects, or diseases. Replace statistical or technical language with human terms. The antidote to dehumanization involves deliberate rehumanization practices. When discussing policies affecting others, imagine specific individuals impacted rather than abstract categories. When conflicts arise, actively seek information about the experiences and perspectives of those you're in conflict with. Perspective-taking exercises provide powerful protection against dehumanization. Research shows that even briefly articulating the viewpoint of someone from a group you're in conflict with reduces dehumanization and increases recognition of moral worth. You don't have to agree with someone to recognize their humanity. Preventing ethical slippery slopes *. Establish clear moral boundaries in advance before situational pressures arise. Create specific if-then plans. If I'm asked to mislead a customer, then I will refuse regardless of pressure. Watch for warning signs, justifications you wouldn't accept from others, decisions you feel uncomfortable sharing, or actions requiring complex rationalizations. Create accountability structures outside the immediate situation. These warning signs function as psychological alarm systems, alerting you to moral danger. External perspective helps counteract the gradual adaptation that makes slippery slopes so dangerous. Building moral courage *. Practice emotional regulation under pressure. Develop clear moral priorities that guide decision-making. Start with small acts of resistance in low-risk situations. Moral courage strengthens with use. As one Holocaust rescuer put it, you don't suddenly become brave enough to hide someone in your attic. You become brave enough through all the small choices you made before. These aren't abstract concepts, but practical skills that develop through conscious practice. By implementing these strategies, we develop critical awareness that questions rather than accepts, moral anchoring to principles rather than situations, deliberate rehumanization of those being marginalized, and ethical pre-commitment that establishes boundaries before pressure arises. The responsibility this knowledge brings weighs heavily. Once we understand how these psychological mechanisms operate, we can no longer claim ignorance when we find ourselves participating in harmful systems. We must accept that resistance isn't automatic or easy. It requires conscious effort against powerful forces that have shaped human behavior throughout history. The question isn't whether these forces will affect you, but whether you'll recognize them when they do and have developed the psychological strength to resist. The line between good and evil doesn't separate us into heroes and villains. It runs through each of us, shifting with the invisible forces we've uncovered together. Everything we've explored shows how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary harm when caught in certain situations. Your greatest protection is humble vigilance, recognizing these mechanisms and choosing resistance, even when uncomfortable. Develop awareness of how authority, roles, language, and incremental changes shape behavior. Like a mirror reflecting our hidden vulnerabilities, the research shows we all could falter. Will you recognize the warning signs and find the courage to stand apart when it matters most?